This evening, Len Clements continues his series of special reports on the plight of the Japanese Americans. Len?
The Army said that these people were potential spies and saboteurs and had to be removed from the West Coast. But in cities like New York, Detroit, Japanese Americans were allowed to move freely into airplane factories and shipyards and other critical wartime industries. In the words of J. Edgar Hoover, the decision to lock them up only in the West was based on political pressure and not on a factual analysis. Discrimination against Japanese Americans did not begin with World War II. It began when the first Japanese settlers arrived here seeking a better life in America.
They came over here searching for fortunes, which they wanted to make and then return to Japan as big shots, you see, and never quite succeeded. Most of them never quite succeeded. But in the meanwhile, they became very much attached to the country and wanted to own land here because they could see so much of it. And they tried awful hard to own it. But the law says that people of Asiatic ancestors who could not become citizens could not own land.
If you can't marry them, if they can't get into certain kinds of jobs, if they can't own property, what you do is to, herd them off into ghettos, and they become invisible. And when somebody's invisible, you can act immorally toward them.
In 1942, a line was drawn through the West Coast states and across the southern half of Arizona. Those Japanese Americans living on the west side of that line were locked up. Those on the east side were allowed to go free. Here in Phoenix, that line was drawn down the center of Grand Avenue. Those people of Japanese descent who lived southwest of Grand were locked up. Those who lived northeast were allowed to go free. Tom Ikeda was among the few who were not sent to camp. He was a produce farmer living and working in Mesa. Although he was not locked up in camp, there were still problems. He ran into trouble when he tried to buy seed for his crop.
They passed a special law forbidding any Japanese or Japanese American to do business in the state. The only thing that we as American and Japanese American could purchase was food and clothing.
Under the law, he could in fact buy seed for his crop, or a rake, or a garden hose, but only if he first advertised 3 times in the newspaper his intent to buy those things and filed a copy of his intent with the Secretary of State. He decided to challenge the state law with a court case.
We had a hard time finding an attorney to take it, and because most of the attorneys didn't want to get involved. It was a hot potato at that time.
But he finally did find an attorney, a man by the name of Z. Simpson Cox.
You'd have to advertise that you were going to buy seed, or you're going to buy equipment or anything like that. But when you advertise, that's doing business with a newspaper. So under the law, you'd have to advertise that you intended to advertise. But that would be doing business with the newspaper. So there would be no end to it. It would mean an absolute cessation of business of anyone of Japanese ancestry.
The law was ruled unconstitutional as a result of their test case. It's important to remember that there was a war going on when this happened, and in times of war, people sometimes act on emotion instead of reason.
It was a general mob feeling, I would say, a lynching feeling. How do people go out and lose all perspective and lynch sometimes innocent people or others, regardless of anything?
During the war, 10 people were convicted of acting as spies for Japan. All of them were Caucasian. Tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, the story of the Japanese Americans who left the camp to serve in the United States Army. One such unit, Bill, went on to become the most decorated unit in United States military history.
Of the Japanese Americans, as they're called, who were incarcerated, what percentage of them were actually American citizens, and what percentage were still citizens of Japan?
Roughly 2/3 of these people were American citizens by virtue of their birthright. They were born here, and because they were born here, they were automatically entitled to become citizens. But fully 1/3 of them were the original immigrant generation who came from Japan. Of those people, they were not allowed to become citizens by United States federal law. That law was eventually changed in 1954, and at that time, fully 98% of that immigrant group became American citizens.
Thank you, Len. Very good.